Hello again, this is Joe from IST Group, and this video is the next in the line of developing a business application from scratch. At IST Group we have received quite a few questions about how to start developing with WSJ.NET. People tend to think that it's a complicated thing with a steep learning curve like all the Java products out there or like Blazor. But in fact, it's a fairly easy thing because with WSJ.NET you stick to your familiar programming language like C#, VB.NET. And the development environment is Visual Studio with its graphical designer. Developing with WSJ.NET is as easy as developing a WinForms application. If you have already worked with WinForms, then WSJ.NET will immediately make you feel at home. You design your forms in the Visual Studio Designer by selecting controls from the toolbox and setting the properties. Then you set up the necessary event handlers, write your business code, and hit F5 to run the application. If it were a WinForms application, the compiler would generate an executable file and run it in debug mode. When you hit F5 on a WSJ.NET application, the code is compiled into a web application that runs on a web server. The browser is launched and you see your application running as a native web application in the browser. You can put breakpoints and debug the code just as you would do in a WinForms application. Now, is that cool or what? The application that I'm about to show today demonstrates how to make a WSJ.NET application from scratch. The way I chose to make it is just one way to do it. The application that I'm about to show today demonstrates how to make a WSJ.NET application from scratch. The way I chose to make it is just one way to do it. You may find it better to follow a different approach. I'll leave that up to you. However, by following this demonstration you will get the idea and you will be able to write your own business application, even if you don't like the way I did it. Okay, so let's start having a look at form inheritance. WSJ.NET applications are able to derive visual forms. The base form here is the one that all other forms are derived from. It does not have any controls on it, but when we look at the code, we see that it already has the command handler. The command handler has been covered in a previous video already. Then it has a create completed property that is set to true after a load has completed. And we have a modified property that is set as soon as the user changes any of the entry fields on the form. Then we have several methods that take care of storing the settings of DataGridView columns to the database. The width, the position, and the visibility of the columns is stored to a special database table so that it can be restored the next time the form starts, and so the user changes the order and visibility of the columns, closes the form, the settings are saved to the database, and the next time the same form is opened again, the column settings that are stored in the database are read and the DataGridView columns are restored. So that makes for a better user experience. Okay, that's basically all. How saving the grid settings is done. If you are interested to see how this is done, you can check out the code. Okay, that's the base form. Then we have the base dialog, which is the modal dialog. It does not have any code. Let's look at it. No code in here. But it has property settings. For example, start position is set to center parent, and the form border style is fixed so that it appears as a modal dialog. We also have the base main form. The base main form has the navigation bar control on the form already, and as you can see, it's an MDI parent form. Let's look at the code. The base main form has a navigation bar. It has a few things that take care of adding items to the navigation bar on the top level or on a sub-level. And most importantly, it has the create MDI child form method. If you pass no parameters, it will simply create a new instance, make it an MDI child, set the parameters, only applies if you pass the parameters, then it will show the child form, and that's it. But if you pass a unique form ID, it will try to find the child form with this form ID, and if it finds it, it will activate it, bring it to the front, and that's it. If it does not find the form, it will create a new one. So by passing a unique form ID, you can control if a form can appear more than one time in the main form, or if it's created every time you call create MDI child form. Okay, the rest of it is pretty straightforward. You can look at the code yourself. It's all uploaded to GitHub. I'll leave a link in the description below. That's the base main form. We also have the base MDI child, which has one control, that's a menu, and it has these three entries. The menu items are used to close the current window, to close all windows, or to close all other windows. It's in German here. I live in Germany. I'm German, so I needed it that way. The code looks like this. We have the unique form ID, which is stored in this property. We have a dictionary of parameters. We have a load method, which registers the commands for closing the windows. We have the create MDI child method as well in this form, because it might happen that you want to open a new child window from a child window and not from the base main form. So this simply forwards the call to the same method in the main window. And we have some methods to close windows. The next topic in line is the question, how do we add child forms to this base main form? So let's create a new form, add a new item. We select UserListForm, very important, and we give it the name UserListForm. Okay. Wait a moment, and here it is. But we don't want to use the UserListForm as it is now. We want to derive from base MDI child form. We need the classes namespace, and we need to call the base constructor. Okay, so now when we go back to the design, we already have a child form. We need some controls, like for example a panel, and we dock this to the top. The size could be 48 pixels high. That's enough. Now we use a button from the toolbox. I don't like this size either. I want it 32 by 32. And we don't need a text here, but we need an image. Okay, let's select one, user lists. That seems like a good image. And the location, we can set this to 12 and 8. Okay, that looks good to me. I made a mistake. I chose the wrong image. I want this to be the new button, so I should use the new image. Okay, that looks much better. We call this button new. and we give it a tooltip. Let's say new user. Okay, but how do we launch this child form? We go to the main form, and right here we have a call to add nav item, which creates a new navigation item. In this case, it will create the navigation item under administration. Currently, the action to be performed is not implemented, but we're doing that now. Create MD child form. The type is the UserListForm, and that's it. So let's have a short look. The application started. We click on the users, and there it is. We do have the new button. We have a tab with the child form. But if we click again on the item in the navigation bar, it will create a new form with each click. We do not want that. We only want one of the user lists active at any given time. So let's go back here and simply pass a unique ID. The unique ID could be the name of the child form, which would be name of UserListForm. Okay, one bracket missing. And now when we start the application, click on users, there it is, click on users again, nothing happens. What actually happens in fact is that the user list form is searched in the list of open windows and brought to the front. But because we only have one window active right now, you won't see anything. Okay, so we have the user list form created. Now let's go on and add a little bit more. First of all, we can add another button. This one would be button edit. It will have the image. There should be edit somewhere. And we call this edit user. Okay, now we have two buttons, and what we need is the data. So we take the DataGridView, dock it to the parent. We call this one, because it will be the only grid in this form, well, simply call this grid. Okay, so the grid needs some data. So let's go to the data source. It will be an object. We check the demo up, go to models, and we find DBUser, which is the model class for the user database table. Click on Finish. Now we have a new binding source, and we have columns. Okay. Now, when we open the application, go to the users list, we do have the columns, but there's still no data. So how do we get data in there? Since we want to start the form with the data list already assigned, so let's go to the events, the load event. Okay, we need to do something here. Let's say we call a function named command load. Okay, and in here we have to do something. We have to open a database connection. DB is a class that I already mentioned in the previous video. It simply gives you a connection to the database. And in the main form, we have already assigned the connection string. So this call will simply return a new database connection that we can use right away. It will already be opened, so we don't need this. But what we need is a SQL statement. In this case, we use select the row ID from the database table and everything else. The table name is users, and we can optionally add an order by clause, last name and first name. So now we have the SQL statement. We also have to access the database and query it. So we take the connection, query. The type we're querying is DB users, DB user. Okay. And we pass in the SQL statement. We could also pass parameters and a transaction variable, but we don't need that at this stage. What do we do with this query? The result will be assigned to our data source. Let's go back. DB user binding source is the name DB user binding source dot data source equals this query, and we have to add to list. Okay, now let's check. Open the users, and hey, there it is. We already have our data. But I see that I can click right into this and edit this. I don't want to do that. So I'm using grid.setDefaults, and if we go there, we can see that it sets a couple of properties. No row headers, it's got to be read-only, multi-selection, and all these stuff. These are the defaults that I usually use, but you can change this at your own needs. Okay, so set defaults simply puts some values into the grid properties that make it look the way I want it to look. Let's have a short look. Okay, now I don't see a focus cell and I cannot edit it. That's actually what I want. Now let's give the buttons some life. Commands is already defined in the base form. What we also need is a register function, and we give it the button new name, and a new shall always be enabled, and when we click the new button, something has to happen. We haven't implemented the edit form yet, so we use utils.not implemented. Okay, now we at least get a nice message. Okay, and because we have to call register for each and every button, I use the Fluent interface. Register the next one. Button edit shall only be active when one of the grid rows is selected. So we use grid.selected count. I can't type today. Selected count. Oh my God. Selected count equals 1. So the edit button is only active if there's exactly one grid row selected. And for the action that has to be performed, I use not implemented as well. So again, let's have a quick check. Open the users, and now when I click edit, I get this utils not implemented function. Okay, that's working so far. Now let's work a little bit on the beauty of this form. First of all, I don't like this title. I don't like all these columns to be visible. Let's do something about that. Let's start with the form itself. I give it a caption, which is user list, and I would also like to give it an image. This time we use this one. We can check if that worked a little bit later. Now I select the grid, go to edit columns, and I get the list of columns. So I want to display the name of the user, if it's system admin or not. I don't want to see that. So I set visible to false. Please note that show in visibility menu is still true. And when you look at these three dots, that's the button for the visibility menu. It's better to explain this visually. When I start this, I see on the right these three dots, and when I click on that, I see a list of columns, and I see that this one is not visible, but it's still in the visibility menu, so I can make it visible just by clicking on it. That way I can also enable, disable all the columns. Okay, let's go back to the list. I don't want the header text to be "is this admin?" I want it to be system admin. Okay, that's what I want. Password, I don't want to let this be visible. And where is show visibility menu? I don't see it. There it is. Okay. So now that I set show in visibility menu to false, it will not be possible to make this column visible. We have the login name, the encrypted password. We don't want to see this either. The salutation, I want this on the front. First name, last name, I already included a name, so I don't need them. Oops. I don't need them visible. Okay, the job title, put a space in there, but don't show it all the time. When has the person been hired? I would like the date only. Do I have it? Oh, there it is. Okay, and it's the lowercase d. Retired, I don't want to see that. I put it to the correct format and make it invisible as well. Is it an admin or not? I'd rather prefer to display the whole row differently when it's an admin, so I don't want to see it in as a column. If the same goes for the active state, visible false, row ID, it doesn't matter anyway, so completely excluded, and State is also an internal field. I don't want to see that. Okay, now I have salutation, name, and login name. I want the login name at the front. I want it to be 150 pixels. Salutation can be a little bit shorter, like 70, and I can call this salutation. Okay, and the name is probably the longest. I'll make this 250. Okay, that's how it looks now. When I run the application, users, I see login name, salutation, name, but I can still activate the other columns. What's missing now? Oh, by the way, the image appears and we have a different caption. What we also see is that the edit button is not enabled anymore. But when I click on one of the rows, it's enabled. Now I add a second selection and it goes inactive again. So it's only active if there is exactly one row selected. That's what we want. Now we have to take care of the 0 in salutation. For this, there is a special class called salutations. This is a lookup class. It defines constants, numerical constants for each salutation. And it has a lookup pair which uses the constant from above and assigns a text to this. So how do we use that? We go to UserListForm right here before we load, and we call lookup.populate. What is the name of the column? Column salutation probably, right? And we use the salutations class and assign the items. Okay. Now we see the squiggly lines, and that's because column salutation is a text box column, but we need it to be a combo box. So let's go back to design mode, click on salutation, and we see the column type is text box column, and we make it a combo box column. And now when we go back, the squiggly lines disappeared and the error is gone. And again, we'll have a quick check. And now we have Mr. instead of 0, because 0 is the ID of the text Mr. Okay, that's good. Now next step is I want administrators to be displayed in bold font. How do I do that? I go to the grid, and while we are here, we can add another event, which would be the double-click event. And in the double-click event, we call a command edit. We don't have it yet, so let's create it. And we can also change this to command edit. Now, when we click on the edit button, it will call command edit. Or if we double click a grid row, it will also call command edit. Unfortunately, we have the edit entry form. We don't have it yet, so let's call it not implemented. Good. In order to display the grid rows differently in a different format, we use the cell formatting event. And in the cell formatting event, we get the DataGridView cell formatting event args. Oh my God, what a name. And in here, we have the cell style. And the cell style also has a font property. And we can assign something here. For example, globals.font bold. Okay, let's go there. Font bold is simply a static property, so it's visible all over the application, and it has been initialized in the main form's load event. So there we have created a bold font. And because it's global in over all sessions and applications, we can use it everywhere, and the bold font is only created once in memory. The advantage is that you don't have to create the bold font in every form where you need it. You just create it once and use it everywhere. Makes sense, in my opinion. Okay, but we don't want to have every row in the user list form to be displayed in a bold font. So what do? First of all, we need the data of the currently selected row. But how to get there? The event args have a row index property. So the grid has a list of data records, and we have the row that is currently in the works. So all we need is access to the list of rows. And how do we do that? We make a private property. It's a list of DB user, because that's what we return from the query. We call it, for example, data list, and need a little typecast here. We also have the DB binding source, which has a data source, and this data source has been assigned right here in the command load. The results from the query went into the data source property. And the data source property is what we are reading here and casting it to the list of DB users, because in the query we also converted it to a list. And now we have access to the data. We go back to the cell formatting, and here we can use data list e.row index. Okay, that's our data. Now we only want to display administrators in bold font. So if data dot is admin, then we set the font to bold. Now let's see if this worked. Administration users, and we see that both are in bold. This is because both are administrators. One last thing is left to show here in this episode, and what I want to do is I want to display the super administrator in red font. So if data is system admin, then we take the cell style and set the fore color to red. Okay. Now let's check the application for the last time in this series of videos. There we go. We have the administrator, the super administrator in bold and red, and the normal administrator in bold only. Okay, that's it for this video. The next video will deal with editing one of the users in a modal dialog. So stay tuned and thanks for listening. Bye bye.